soothing story time. The escape of the winter cabbages. The creatures of nature always loved snow. They loved snow almost as much as they loved stories. So when it snowed, they told winter stories. Beam went first. In the time of winter, before the first snow, but when the frost turned the ground and roofs white and froze the water in the bird baths, the winter cabbages became restless. They had two reasons for wanting to leave. They lived in a high-walled vegetable garden in the centre of a town called Bumblegate, and frankly they wanted a better view. The only view they had was the 3 brick walls and the back of a house. They wanted to get away to the fields that the robin had told them about. They were full-sized now, having grown up over the summer and autumn, and they felt it was time to get out on their own and explore. Also, they were rather worried. The sparrows had told them that there were giant caterpillars made of ice that ate cabbages, and they did not wish to be eaten. But they did not know. The sparrows had made this up. The winter cabbages looked at the 4 walls surrounding them, looked at each other, and nodded. The cabbage patch looked like a jewelled garden. The frost sparkled. The cabbages would leave the walled garden. They would find the beautiful fields beyond the walls of brick that filled the town, and escape the hungry jaws of the giant ice caterpillar. They spent the rest of the day deciding what to do. The people didn't come out much at night, so that is when they would leave. But they didn't know what was behind the walls, so they talked to the birds and asked them about the town. The pigeons gave them the best locations for chips. The cabbages were puzzled, but thanked them anyway. Each bird gave a different description, depending on where they liked to perch and where the best source of food was that they liked to eat. A seagull told them all about a woman who put out food on the roof of a shed, which was not at all helpful for a cabbage, but the seagull enjoyed talking about it. The cabbages didn't mind. Cabbages are patient creatures. As the sun disappeared, the cabbages were surreptitiously pulling up their roots and shaking off the dirt. As the owner of the house was eating her supper, the cabbages were pushing the large wooden crate to the middle of the wall that the bird said led to a passage between the houses. When the owner of the house turned down the lamp in her bedroom, the cabbages were all gathered round the wooden crate, their eyes turned to her window. "Ooh," they said, "it's gone dark," and they began their escape. The cabbages next to the crate acted as steps for the other cabbages to climb up to the crate. They lifted their cabbage friends up with their leaves. The first cabbages on the crate formed a block and lifted up more cabbages to form the next, slightly smaller block. Anyone who looked out of their window and who could see in the dark would have witnessed a cabbage pyramid being formed. The cabbages, still waiting on the ground in the garden, watched as a cabbage reached the top of the wall and peered over. There was indeed a passageway there. The cabbage looked back at its cabbage friends and nodded. The cabbages on the ground began to climb up the layers of cabbage pyramid. The cabbage pyramid helped them up with their leaves as they went. When they reached the top, they moved out along the wall. When there was a full row of cabbages along the wall, a large cabbage gripped the top of the wall and took the leaf of the cabbage next to it and lowered it down. The cabbage next along to that climbed down and held on. They formed a ladder of cabbages. The cabbages left in the garden climbed up the cabbage pyramid and down the cabbage ladder to the passageway. Then the cabbages heard footsteps. The passage was almost completely dark. As they could see was the vague shape of a person. They flattened themselves against the wall. Neville stumbled along in the dark, saw a change in the shade of the wall, like there was something there. Neville lit a match, saw a ladder of cabbages hanging on to each other, a line of cabbages along the ground by the wall, and a line of cabbages on top of the wall. All the cabbages turned to look at him. Neville turned around, ran out of the passage as fast as he could, and through the streets back to the pub, and huddled in a corner with a drink, making odd squealing noises, and had to be escorted home the long way by 5 people, but never mentioned to anyone what he had seen, in case the cabbages came back and got him. He did, though, earn the nickname Nervous Veg Nev, as he used to make a small wailing noise whenever he looked at a vegetable patch. The cabbages carried on climbing the wall. A few snowflakes began to fall. "Ooh," the cabbages said and looked up. Light from windows a few streets away caught the gently falling snow. Then shadows from the houses masked the snow in darkness. The last cabbages formed a ladder, and the one at the bottom climbed up the ladder to the top of the wall, then the next down, and so on until they were all out of the garden. They climbed down till there was only the cabbage forming the ladder into the passage left. The cabbages on the ground checked no people were coming. The cabbage bumbled along to each end of the passage and peered round the wall, then waved a cabbagey leaf to show that it was safe to go. The other cabbages gathered under the cabbage ladder and caught each cabbage as it let go. The last cabbage on top of the wall jumped and was safely caught. They set off to the left, as that was the way the birds told them the fields were. The cabbage at the other end of the passage bumbled along to join them. As the cabbages came to the end of the passage, They slowed down. The cabbage already stationed at the end of the passage waved a leaf, and a few cabbages went forward. The passage led out onto a street, mostly houses, one or two shops. The light from inside the houses faintly lit the street. They could see the shadows of people moving in the houses, but there was no one on the street. The snow was beginning to lay on the cold ground. They passed the word back along the line of cabbages to get ready. One cabbage at the end of the passage looked left, then right, then bumbled as fast as it could across the street to the passage opposite, for cabbages can't run fast. The other cabbages watched and waited. The cabbage bumbled across the pavement, then into the road, reached up with its roots and half jumped, half rolled onto the opposite pavement, then across into the shadows of the passage. Safe. The other cabbages waved their leaves in triumph at the brave cabbage. The next three cabbages looked left, looked right, and then bumbled their fastest across the road to the passage. They reached the safety of the shadows and waved to the other cabbages, who waved back. Then the remaining cabbages thought, "What the hell?" and en masse bumbled out of the passage and across the streets to the other passage. One child saw them from her bedroom window, but as she was meant to be asleep, she didn't tell anyone till the morning, and of course they thought she had got confused and seen whoever had stolen the cabbages rolling them along the street from one passage to another, but she knew what she had seen. When the cabbages were all safely in the dark passage, they did a happy dance. Then they bumbled along the passage to find out what was at the end of this passageway. There was another street with falling snow, similar to the last, but no passage opposite. As the cabbages looked, they realized there were no more passages, would have to walk along the road in front of the houses and take another road in the direction of the fields. They didn't like it, but there was no other choice. They watched for a while to see if one of the roads at either end of the street were busy. The road to the right was wider, and a few people passed along it, so left it was. One cabbage went first and tried to bumble along and flatten itself along the wall of the house at the same time. It had trouble with the doorstep, leaning on them too hard and overbalancing backwards while still trying to bumble along. But eventually it got past the houses to the end of the road, pressed itself against the corner of the house and peered round, looking left and right. To the left there were a few people further down the street, chatting on a doorstep, but no one walking about. The cabbage signalled for the others to come too. The rest of the cabbages began to bumble along close to the wall. Then the people chatting in the doorway said good night, and two people began walking towards the road. The cabbage waved its leaves around frantically and then bumbled as fast as it could back to the passageway. The cabbages all turned around and did the same, a sea of bouncing green heading to the dark gap between the houses. The people turned the corner into the street, but were chatting and not really looking where they were going, so did not see the last of the cabbages disappear into the passage. They slunk back as best they could and lined up along the wall. The people carried on chatting happily, caught a few snowflakes, laughed, and carried on past the passage and along to another road. The cabbages relaxed, and then they tried again. Twice more they had to bumble back to the passageway. They waited till a few more lights went out and tried again. Finally they were all gathered at the end of the street and turned right, bumbling along in the dark, snowflakes falling from the tops of their leaves. The snow was now falling heavily. They left cabbage tracks behind them. Luckily everyone seemed to be tucked up in bed, and there was no one to see them. At the end of this street was another road, but this one had dead ends. There were a few gaps between the houses. The cabbages went to look. They only led to the back gardens of the houses. The cabbages huddled together to decide what to do next. They got out of one garden so they could get out of another. They gathered at the entrance to one passageway, could just make out a wall at the back, decided this was a good one to try, and all bumbled off down the passage, across a lawn, into a leafless flower border, and climbed up the wall, forming a cabbage pyramid. On top of the wall the cabbages looked out into the dark. The snow was highlighting the shapes of the backs of the houses. There was no way through in a house close to them, but there looked like gaps further up. One cabbage bumbled along the top of the wall to the next one for the next house, along wall after wall, till it found a house with another passageway, then waved its leaves, and the other cabbages bumbled along to join it. They climbed down the wall, across a paved area with a washing line, over a gate, and out into the front garden. Then they saw it. In the distance, through a gap between two houses, lit up by the snow. Fields. They bounced up and down excitedly, looked left to right. The street was clear. They bumbled happily across the road, up onto the pavement, over a fence, down a passageway, over a gate, and into a long back garden. They travelled along a path covered in snow to the fence at the end of the garden. They could see fields through the gaps in the fence. They joyously made a pyramid on one side and a ladder down on the other. And they were there. They were in a field. For a while, at the edge of a field, a large group of cabbages did a happy dance under falling snow. Then a large group of cabbages set off across the field to get under the cover of trees. By the time they had got to the end of the field, the sun was just starting to come up. They bumbled along a hedge to get to a gate, but there was a noise. There were several farmers nearby, up early. Unfortunately, they were at the other end of the field the cabbages wanted to cross, and given the ground was white and the cabbages were green, would be bound to see them crossing the field. The cabbages drew back and decided what to do. One cabbage came up with a plan. The farmers stood talking, planning their day, occasionally stamping their feet to keep warm. It was still snowing heavily, so they did not see what looked like a line of large snowballs crossing the field. Each cabbage had made itself into a snowball, poked a hole in the snow with a bit of hedge to make an eye hole, and bumbled across the field. It was a bold plan, but it had worked, as farmers do not expect a large group of winter cabbages dressed as snowballs crossing their fields. The cabbages made it to the other side, snuck along the line of the hedge to a gate, snuck under the gate, and bumbled across the next field. Back in the town, the owner of the vegetable garden the winter cabbages used to live in was furious. Someone had stolen her cabbages and left a trail of dirt up her wall, but out in the passageway there was no sign. It was full of snow without tracks. She reported the theft to the local police and to all her neighbours. The sun was high in the sky by the time the cabbages reached the hill that was covered in trees, but the sun was not visible. Snow clouds were still sprinkling the countryside with their frozen crystals, which luckily hid the tracks of the cabbages. The cabbages bumbled round the hill, exploring, and decided it was just what they wanted. They even found some of their bird friends up in the trees. They spent the winter there and the spring. They even had baby cabbages there. After a few years it was known as Cabbage Hill, because of all of the cabbages that happily grew there. The end.